What's up, guys? Coach Andrew Simmons here, and I wanted to talk a little bit about some TrainingPeaks metrics. Some pretty common questions I get when athletes first start up. We're going to go over fitness, fatigue, and form. I think of these things probably a little bit differently than some people do, but I'll explain it in the way that's easiest to understand. So let's take a look inside TrainingPeaks here. We're going to open up the dashboard. I'm going to choose a point in time when I was doing a significant amount of training. So the way we're going to do that, and the chart that we're actually going to look at, is the performance management chart. This looks specifically at all of your data, and it's going to be graphed basically looking at a certain period of time. So let's go ahead and first adjust the period of time that we're looking at here. I'm going to go through some custom dates. I did CIM back in 2016, and I had a really good training period leading up to that. So let's go ahead and look at about this 6 months before that. So we'll go back all the way to June, actually. So closer to 7 months here, and we'll look at the buildup and everything that's happening in here. Click Apply and Close. So the first and foremost, let's go ahead and look at race day, 12/4 of 2016. I ran that marathon in personal best of 2:39. My intensity factor for that race was a 0.94, meaning I was at about 94% of my set threshold. So whether I adjusted my zones recently or not, given that this could be a little bit off, but not uncommon for me to see an athlete complete a marathon at 0.92, 0.9, 0.88. Anywhere in there is a pretty normal intensity factor number. The next thing we're going to see is the ATL, which stands for acute training load, which means at 78, my acute training load, we're looking at the last 7 days. How did the last 7 days of training affect my what we call CTL? So where was that? Was that higher or lower than my average? So we're just looking at, for the acute training load, the last 7 days of training stress, and that's what we call TSS. Each workout is scored based on an algorithm, and that's what we call training stress. Training stress is, TSS is what we're also going to use to calculate our fitness. And so I like to think of this as a moving or rolling average of our fitness over the last 6 weeks or 42 data points. So my fitness leading into that race was a 73. And there is no correlation between mileage and CTL or ATL. It's just a function of how much training I'm putting in respective to my zones in that point in time. The last one is going to be our form. And that's going to be, mine was relatively high. I like to be very well recovered at 22. Anything above 0 is what we call your 0 is your homeostasis point, so 22 is very recovered. We normally like to see athletes, especially those that are training for long distance endurance events, 0 being homeostasis. You don't want to go much below the line, below minus 30 for runners. We see cyclists and triathletes that can often get much deeper than that for a training camp or for a big stint of training, but for most runners we get below minus 30 and into the 40s, and either their zones are set incorrectly or we're seeing that form is they're really digging a deep hole at that point. So I don't like to see a much bigger hole for my athletes than maybe minus 25, minus 30 in their peak week of buildup. So if we go and look back here, we can actually see where my biggest training cycle for this race was. We can see a big ramp. So you can see that the CTL here consistently picked up leading up to this race. And then I had a big long taper that went down. So you can see that at the very peak of my training here, so November 16th, my TSB was only a minus 11, which was pretty big for me. I don't handle training stress all that well. Long runs and things like that, this particular workout, if we click on it, was 8 by a K and then a warm-up and cool down of about 10K. So it's a big workout for me, and you can see that all these other dots are going to look at intensity factors. So the higher the dot is, the higher the intensity factor for the whole workout is. And the red dots here are going to look at training stress. So you can see that For the events that I did, I had a couple of long runs here on Sundays that had, and Wednesdays, for my midweek long runs and things like that, that had a pretty high amount of training stress. But the biggest one by far was my race. So you can see that I was digging a small hole here now and again. Minus 24 was my largest, but that was pretty early in my cycle when I wasn't as well trained. So you can see that I developed, and this is what we call periodization. This is the beauty of looking at this, that as I adapted, I didn't always go back to 0, but I got out of the hole towards minus 7. At the time, I wasn't keeping my zones up to date in TrainingPeaks. I was mostly just using this to kind of track some data and kind of be curious about it. And I've since adjusted my zones a couple times into the future. So this data that we're looking at may not be 100% reflective of exactly what happened back in 2016, but worth taking a look at. So all of this information kind of shows the adaptation principle of rest and recovery, and then we can see this long yellow line that leads up to the race day. You can call that recovery. So the way that I like to think of it, even though fatigue, normally seeing these big spikes, you can see that I was adding in more and more fatigue. I was getting more and more fatigued throughout my training cycle until I tapered down. I also like to think of form, since it's a negative number, I like to think about digging a hole. So the more negative I am, the more fatigued I am, and the less recovered I am. So it's kind of an inverse relationship. You can look at it both ways. That's the way that my brain, as a coach, likes to look at it. So yeah, that's kind of the basics of ATL, CTL, and TSB, both from a visual perspective, and from a, I guess, data perspective, looking at an old race file here. So we can dive in a little bit more on how to actually go through your data at some point in the future. So if you'd like, feel free to shoot us an email with any questions to the coaches@lifelongendurance.com email address. If you'd like to see more of these videos, let us know.